Hey, hi. Thank you everyone for being here. Our next guest needs no introduction. He was fed smoked salmon sandwiches by Harold Wilson's political secretary, Marcia Williams, in Number 10 when he was 12. He rekindled the local branch of Young Socialists in Hampstead Garden suburb at 16 and fought to merge his grammar school in Hendon with the local secondary Modern. He went on to invent the Red Labour Rose, which relaunched Neil Kinnock in 1986 and was one of the architects of New Labour, which led to Tony Blair's election as Prime Minister in 1997. He's the former Labour MP for Hartlepool and served in Blair's cabinet and was a trade commissioner in Brussels. He's now in the House of Lords. He always has things to say which are worth listening to, even if they're uncomfortable for the Labour Party and for its leaders. Peter, we're delighted to have you here this afternoon. Over to you.
Sally, thank you very much, and I shall try my best as ever not to make people feel too uncomfortable. You know how sympathetic I am. And can I say that I was absolutely delighted that Wes Streeting opened this morning's conference. And he said something which really stuck in my mind. He said, values are timeless, but meaningless if we cannot get into power. Bang on. And I join with everyone in saying to Wes, we wish you well in the fight you have ahead of you. It's a big personal health fight, and we need you back and well as soon as possible. Now, we also heard from Keir, and I thought his message could not have been clearer. Labour must change to win. And I take that as progressive Britain's marching orders. Our job is to help him see through what he's got to do, build energy in the party for change, enthusiasm for change, not flinch if others head for the hills, and believe me, they will. I've been round this course twice before. And to help him build the new electoral coalition that Labour needs for victory. And that must not mean jumping, by the way, from the bold to the bland. Now, the coalition we need has to be rooted in the mainstream majority of the country, who are there to be persuaded, by the way, of the fairer, richer, safer future that a progressive Britain can offer. But they want efficacy, relevance and practicality, as well as values. And also, they want a cultural and an emotional connection. And I don't think that's much to ask for. And it's not too much for us to offer. In this task, yes, Labour should be prepared to reach out to other parties on the left-leaning side of the country and build relations in a spirit of cooperation and humility. But let's remember, friends, that to win, we have to convert an awful lot of Tory switchers. Cooperation does not remove the need for deep-rooted change in our party to make Labour electable, which at the moment it isn't. And no number of progressive alliances will make the hard choices that we have to make any easier. Now, before anything else, we have to get right our central appeal to the electorate, defined by new policy ideas that are relevant to the 21st century, anchored in our belief that freedom does not come from being self-made or self-sufficient, but from a strong society, a platform on which everyone can stand and grow and, when necessary, be protected as well. And the government's job, our government's job, is to put that platform in place and to secure it for every generation. This platform will change in the means needed to sustain it, but not in the ends that it serves. We are a revisionist party, not a conservative one. We are prepared to rethink how we achieve our social and economic goals in the light of new circumstances, new ideas, and now, of course, the technological revolution that's underway. We didn't win in 1945 or 1964 or 1997 by remaining tied to our past. The very opposite on each occasion, believe me. Nor did we win as a sectional party of the trade unions, and nor did we win as a party simply of the industrial working class. We've never won a majority that way. When we've won, we've done so as a party of and for the whole of the country, a party appealing across class and geography as a movement of conscience and reform, which people could enthusiastically vote for in the knowledge that we were going to govern well on everyone's behalf, because we are, 1, modern, 2, fair in our policies, and 3, strong in our leadership. And all those 3 things are necessary to win. We will lose votes if we are radical but not modern, including in the public sector, which Keir was right to highlight this morning. We will lose votes if we don't stand clearly for fairness. Fair rules in tax and crime and welfare and immigration, as well as fair shares. And we will lose votes if our leader, harried by factions and forces of conservatism in our own party, is unable to lead and demonstrate his strength in the party and to the country. If anyone has doubts about this, just look at our experience in the last 4 general elections since 2010 and ask yourselves why the party we love has lost, 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 and lost again since we were last in government. So let's not put our party in a position where we know we're going to lose votes. It seems extraordinary to me that we even have to say that and sort of persuade the party that it needs to put itself on the winning side. But I still remember when I said to a fellow canvasser in Lambeth in the early 1980s that we must listen to the voters and their priorities. And you remember what he said to me? Yes, Peter, but there's a limit to how far we can compromise with the electorate. Now keep that thought in mind as we enter the policy review that Keir has launched, and ask yourselves at every stage of that review, are we listening to the instincts of the voters or to the preferences of the party? And as John Crudder said earlier, sincerity for us as a party is not enough. People are looking for instrumentality, not just sincerity from Labour, the policy actions that will improve their lives and make a real difference to them. Now, we should not fight any election, and let me say this, with a battle plan or a manifesto from the past, including the one that gave us our landslide in 1997. There are some in the party who think that if we sit tight on our previous policies, the electorate, don't worry, they'll soon catch up with us because we know best. Well, that our only problem in 2017 or 2019 was that we were ahead of our time, really? And that the experience of the pandemic now means that the public will now see the efficacy of our previous policies and just put that cross beside the Labour name? Look, it's a remarkable conceit to tell the voters that they are now allowed to see the error of their false consciousness and to catch up with us. We're not going to win that way. And I don't yet see the Heartland seats we lost in 2017 falling over themselves to return to Labour, just as we wait for them to catch up with us. And actually, I'm glad that Keir was clear this morning that we are not writing our next manifesto on the basis of our past manifestos. We've got to leave our have our own vision of the future, we've got to do that hard work for ourselves. Now, how will we fill this gap? In my view, there are three essential tasks in forging a new centre-left project for Labour. First, we need clarity about our mission and our values, the driving purpose of our party. Purpose. What do we exist to do? What are we there for? To make people's lives different and better. Without that, we're simply rudderless. Clause 4 of the party constitution spells out our mission of ensuring that wealth, power, and opportunity are in the hands of the many, not the few. Now we have to apply our values to the world as it is in the 21st century, in a market-based economy where the capitalist system, yes, needs reforming, all right, but not replacing, and where it is the government's job to make sure that prosperity doesn't just seep through society, but is distributed widely by direct government intervention. Second, we need to address the challenges facing the country. We need clear analysis of the problems and opportunities that Britain is likely to face in the 2020s and beyond, preparing our working age population for the new economy powered by digital and AI, dealing with the existential threat of climate change, managing the exponential growth of demand for public services given the aging population, revitalizing the welfare state, strengthening the link between contribution and reward, and forging a role for the UK in the world after Brexit. After we lost office in 2010, gird yourselves, let's face it, the centre-left in our party had become quite intellectually stale. After a long period in power, we were politically exhausted, rather like the Attlee government in 1951. Governing while also rethinking our entire policy agenda was hard to do, and the world was moving on around us, requiring the centre-left radically to rethink our approach to the economy, to politics, and to society. The 2008 financial crisis underlined the fragility of Western capitalism, the fiscal shock it unleashed and the consequent pressures on public spending meant that our core argument about investment versus cuts, frankly, had less credibility. Social democracy had to stand for more than expanding the welfare state and for public expenditure. Meanwhile, new forces were fracturing our politics, not least the growing threat of Scottish independence and, of course, the UK's departure from the European Union. The relatively benign conditions of late 1990s Britain, shaped by the end of the Cold War and a revived economy, had largely disappeared. In this new world, which has shaped the last decade, we have to be prepared to think afresh for ourselves. And this is the purpose of Progressive Britain. We have to be better at listening to a much broader range of voices, challenging ourselves and drilling down into our own ideas. That is the intellectual hard graft that we've got to take on. Now, the third task of forging a new political project for our party is to understand the changing values and aspirations of the electorate, who are now less tribal than ever before. We need a much deeper understanding of where the electorate is going, because if we are seeing an emerging realignment, and there are signs that we are, we need to be ahead of that realignment, not stepping into an economic and cultural chasm created by it. We should reject a binary choice between voters. Let's not get trapped in binaries. It is plainly inadequate for Labour to say, we are for the industrial working class, to point a finger at our opponents and call them Tories and just assume that the votes will roll in. If there was ever an era of that, it's now deeply and profoundly and conclusively behind us. The places once referred to as Labour's heartlands have moved on. It's not so much those towns and communities now that are left behind, as much as the Labour Party that's being left behind. The need for Labour to create a new electoral coalition is nothing new. We've had to do it many times before. In the 1930s and 1940s, my grandfather, Herbert Morrison, had to resolve how Labour could appeal to the black-coated voter, the black-coated worker, the rising clerical and white-collar middle class who were becoming a more important part of the workforce relative to the industrial working class. Now, we face a similar challenge now. And at the same time, if the working class is shrinking and our vote within it is getting smaller, we do not just jump to the conclusion that all we need is more university graduates who live in gentrified inner cities with jobs in the service economy. If that's all we needed to do, we would actually have done quite well in the last election and indeed last week. No, we need a wider political electoral base than that. One that enables Labour to be truly national, UK party, with policies that excite all those who are aspirational and want to get on and have a conscience too, yes, and a desire for reform. And this also means coming to terms with the Brexit referendum, accepting the result and moving on. It means recognizing that those who voted for Brexit did so for understandable and legitimate reasons. Labour respects the referendum result. Our policy thinking must now focus on how the UK can develop a sustainable relationship with the European Union, recognizing the EU remains our closest and most important economic partner. When we engage with voters, we showed successfully in the local and mayoral elections what we can do as a party when we really are engaging with our voters. For example, in the west of England, Peterborough, in Manchester and West Yorkshire, even in Worthing and Chipping Norton, in Wales, a sensible Labour administration has won Labour's confidence in handling the pandemic. I know many will be disappointed by the results that we had elsewhere, and nobody feels it more deeply than I do with what happened in Hartlepool. But even there, there are a new broom of Starmerites there who've taken back control of the party in the last year from the infantile left and who are now beginning to rebuild. And we've got to do that elsewhere across the country. So let me just say this in conclusion. What Progressive Britain believes is that it is time for change, turning defeat into a catalyst, not a catalyst for futile chatter about challenges to the leadership. Thank you very much. Nobody in the party will thank anyone for that. No, a different sort of catalyst, a catalyst for further reform of the party. It's not our leader that needs changing, it's our party that has to change. And our job is to back him up in what he needs to do, and that's what I know Progressive Britain will do. As I said to you before, I have been twice round this course, first with Neil Kinnock, then with Tony Blair. The electoral challenge we face now, I have to say to you, is far bigger than that which we faced in the 1980s. And that means that Keir's got to go further, faster. He has to be both Kinnock and Blair rolled into one. So let's start by learning the lessons of our all too rare victories, as well as our all too numerous defeats. And perhaps I might also suggest this, with all the humility for which I am famous, that the party might progress if we heard a little less from Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell on what Labour needs to do to win elections, and listened a little bit more to people who have actually won them. I've already said no one is suggesting we return to the policy prospectus of the 1990s, but it might also be an idea, and I just leave you with this thought, to stop treating New Labour as an embarrassing aunt in the corner of the room, and more as something which might, just might, offer some insight on what it takes to win and defeat the Tories. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Everyone's clapping. We can't hear them, but they're all clapping you. Thank you for giving us energy and reminding us that this is about winning. It's been so interesting to hear your ideas about building a new national base and connection. And as usual, you've also told us some home truths in typically direct style. I'm sure the discussion will continue well beyond this conference. And thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you, Peter, for coming today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now we're going on to the next session, where we'll be discussing the politics of belonging and the economics of well-being. And I'm joined now by Alison McGovern, the MP for Wirral South, and the Shadow Minister for Culture and Sport, and Progress's outgoing chair, strategy chair, and Duncan Weldon, who is a former Labour and TUC policy advisor and is now the Britain economic correspondent at The Economist and author of a forthcoming book, 200 Years of Muddling Through, the surprising story of Britain's economy from boom to bust and back again. If the audience have, we're recording this as we're recording everything. If the audience have any questions, can you please put them into the chat and we will ask them at the end. Alison, well, I can't see you here. Alison, can you tell me?
Sally.
Hi.
Hi.
Can you? So, what do you think? Peter's still here. Can you tell me now what you think of what Peter has to say about the Labour Party and what the Labour Party has to do?
I always listen carefully to every word that Peter says. It's been fair to say that the past 5-6 years have been something of a struggle, but the group that I chaired, Progress, that has joined together with others to form Progressive Britain, has benefited from Peter's advice and support through an incredibly difficult time. So we are all massively grateful to him as ever. I feel enthusiastic and pretty inspired by what I've heard so far in the conference today. I feel like listening to everybody over Zoom has been such a tonic in comparison to Progress conferences that I have spoken at over the past 5 years, where we essentially had to make an argument for progressive politics at all, for that idea that you embrace the future, whatever that means, and eschew nostalgia and that tendency that many on the left have to look to the past. The idea that, you know, we serve the public and the country above all else, and that we're interested in practical policies. Those are the tenets of what I think of as progressive politics. And sometimes it's been necessary to make an argument for progressive politics. Now it feels like a much more invigorating and important time, because we're not just making an argument for the progressive principle in politics. We're going to, as Peter rightly set out, robustly interrogate our own ideas about what that means. And I think that's why today's event is very important, and I'm glad to be a part of it. But it's also why by the time we are able to meet in person next year for next year's Progressive Britain conference, I hope that we will be having really strong, heated and in-depth debate about exactly what's coming out of the policy review and where we think we can really make a difference in our Labour politics and our policy platform that will really see us win with the country. So I think it's very invigorating, and I thank everybody for being a part of it. Sally, I hope you'll forgive me if I just take a moment to thank Wes for opening up the conference. Obviously, we are all massively inspired by him, the challenge that he is facing, but I know absolutely everybody in the Labour Party's heart is with him over the next few weeks and months. He's an incredible person to work alongside, and I'm so grateful that he is one of us. I also want to briefly thank the Progress team for all that they've done to put this and everything else together. It's been great to work with them, and they know how much they all mean to me. So I just want to say a couple of brief points very quickly, just to start the conversation, I suppose, on if the Labour Party needs to change, how should it do that, and importantly, what should its focus be? Anas, when he spoke earlier, Anas Sarwar made some very important points about the 11 years gone by in which he and I have both been in frontline politics. We were elected on the same day in 2010, and he said that losing had made him a better person. And I hate losing. I absolutely bitterly hate losing. But it has also made me think really hard about what I am Labour for and what I think we should all be in the Labour Party for. What it is that we really want for people in our country, what unites our country, what makes us, and what is it that can really bring us together and give us a sense of purpose. In other words, how can we give people that sense of belonging in a country that is for them and serves them? Interesting also, Chris Curtis's statistics earlier highlighting that health is right at the top of the public agenda at the moment, particularly mental health. But many people, in the conference today will understand that you really can't separate out mental health and physical health. They interact with each other, and so have to be part of the same agenda. Now, Keir Starmer mentioned also that our policy agenda needs to be cross-cutting, and we need to make sure that we're focused on how government works and making sure that it works well. So all of this has brought me to the conclusion that when we think about our policy objectives and our priorities, we have been too narrow. We often think of the economy as being the driving force in our politics. Harold Wilson said, unemployment above all else made me political, and he was right to say that. But I think there's more to it than that. And obviously there are reflections from the pandemic that play into this as well. We know now that the public health is a very important input to the economy, and people's priorities around health will always be the foundation for politics. So the question I ask myself is, how do we need to look again at economics and think about not just whether people have got a job, but how they're able to live their life? Could a more progressive economic growth also mean a population that is happy, more satisfied, more comfortable, able to achieve more human success on their own terms? Now, this is a question that is broadly thought of as in the terms of well-being. People will be aware of the work of Lord Richard Layard in the PLP on this subject. And so I and others in the shadow government have been doing some thinking about how could Labour progress some ideas about well-being, health and happiness that would help us have a more attractive and hopefully successful policy programme going into government. So I'll just say a couple of words about that, Sally, and then I'll shut up because others will want to reflect on it as well. For me, there's three aspects to this question. How do you create a government that's able to improve people's quality of life, to give them a real sense of well-being? There's the philosophical question, there's practical questions, and finally there's the projection of the idea. On the philosophical side of things, it's easy to think about happiness and well-being and to imagine that really what we need are more celebrities on Instagram, talking up positive thinking and positive feeling. But actually, that's not really the kind of substantive policy change that we need. As I said, for me, it's about human success on people's own terms. That idea of increasing the opportunities, the ambition that people have for themselves. And there are significant sort of philosophical underpinnings do that, the key question is knowing what success would look like and how we would measure it. As it happens, the Office for National Statistics now collates a whole host of data on the public in terms of their own feelings of their mental well-being, and also harder statistics like the prevalence of mental ill health, as well as traditional data measures like unemployment that we know contribute to the public well-being. So once we've decided what it is that we're going to measure, then I think that government can have an ambitious national plan to improve public well-being. And that's what I think we need to work on and figure out the aspects of that. We know that in our time in government, for example, the National Goal on Child Poverty, that unifying simple objectives enabled the government to work well together efficiently and effectively. And I think that's even more true now. Oh, I've just had a Zoom glitch there. We know that national goals bring the government together and help it work at its most efficient and effective. And for me, it's also making sure that the national plan that we have for public well-being is a worked example of progressive universalism. That we have policies, for example, on our schools or the health service, that everyone can be a part of and that serve the entire population, but help those most that are at risk from mental ill health, physical ill health, or educational disadvantage. So I suppose the question that I have, and that I and others will be working on over the coming year, is what are the aspects, what have we learned from the pandemic? What is it that we really want that will help improve that quality of life? As Keir has said on many times, best country to grow up in, best country to grow old in. Ambition for our kids, dignity for our older loved ones. But what does that mean? And we need to work on that. Finally, I think it's very important that we think about how to project this idea. We need to talk about the way that we want the country to be in everyday language, in words that I would use if I spoke to people on my street, not the kind of Westminster journalese that often, I think, dominates our public debate, particularly in sort of Westminster politics. I think there is a very strong national story for Labour to tell, whether that is our role in giving people access to green spaces and things like the many Labour councils across the country who have worked hard to give access to swimming and to physical activities to help children have a rounded education. I think there's a very strong national story for us to tell about the importance of quality of life that is not just simply making sure people have a job to go to and money in their pockets, important and crucial though that is. It's about adding to that vision to make sure that we care about the economy and inclusion in our economy in a full and rounded sense. So for me, that's where wellbeing, I think, has a huge role to play in Labour's policy programme to come. And I'm excited to hear about people's ideas about making it real. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alison. I was going to move on to Duncan to ask about the economics of well-being and exactly what that means, because in Finland and in New Zealand, budgets are actually set according to well-being. So I wondered, Duncan, if you could chat a bit about what that is and what that might actually look like.
Of course, Sally. I mean, yes, there are countries in the world. New Zealand has moved to it recently. Finland has been there for a while, where they take much more account of these sort of wider subjective well-being factors, which tends to be survey work done by sort of the equivalent of the Office of National Statistics, asking people how their lives are going, asking about stress levels, asking about happiness. I mean, this sort of work, it's all very important. And the Office of National Statistics has been doing some of that work itself in Britain for the last 10 years or so, really. Sort of trying to bring it more into the policy making. I think it's really important. I mean, I'm also old-fashioned enough, though, to think GDP does kind of matter. That if you're growing your economy and there's more money about, I mean, people often say, I don't care about GDP, but I think what we've seen over the last decade is if you get a decade in which GDP does not grow very much and real wages do not grow very much, then what you end up with is squeezed public services, squeezed pay packets, and actually quite fractious and unhappy politics. The British economy, when it is growing, that is useful. I think what I would step back and say, if we're thinking about the politics of place, economics of well-being, is it's that word place which is really important. And if you look at the record of the last Labour government, 1997, until say the crisis in 2008, on all of your traditional economic indicators you'd look at, that record is very strong. Low unemployment, high employment growth, fast GDP growth, very good productivity growth, very well-funded public services, big increases in health and education spending, tax credits and the minimum wage doing a lot for people at the bottom of the labour market. But those traditional sort of indicators we look at miss out a few things. They miss out that real wages for median earners, people in the middle of the distribution, started to really slow down from about 2002 onwards. You had 5 or 6 years before the crisis when the typical earner in the middle of the labour market was not seeing their standard of living rise very much. And importantly, they miss out place, because Britain is a very unusual economy, the extent of the divisions within it. There's no other country in Europe with quite as much of a gap between the richest parts of it and the rest of it. So a uniquely divided country. Politicians, various things, it's not just the government talking about levelling up now or rebalancing under Cameron Osborne or regional development agencies under the last Labour government. You can go all the way back to the 1920s. Governments have tried different attempts at sort of regional rebalancing policies. But I think, I think if you want to get into a real discussion about well-being and an economy which means something to people all over the country, we need to start thinking about how growth looks in different parts of the countries. And I'll just make one final introductory comment, if that's all right. I mean, this is often spoken about sort of in terms of deindustrialization. Britain underwent deindustrialization in the 1980s and the 1990s. And what we're left with now is sort of a similar share of industrial workers to most of the rest of Western Europe. Very similar to France, lower than Germany, but very similar to France. But it felt more retching in Britain because Britain was a very, very industrialized country. Britain in 1966, 1967 had a higher share of industrial workers than anywhere else in Western Europe. And now we've gone back to the average. It was a retching change. But I think it's really important when we talk about industrial jobs, manufacturing jobs, and coal mining jobs. The reason people want these jobs back in their communities is because they were good jobs. I don't think it's because they're particularly attached to metal bashing or coal mining. What they miss is the good nature of those jobs. They were jobs people could get. They could be trained up in those jobs. They could earn a high standard of living from those jobs. And if you go back into British economic history, manufacturing jobs and coal mining jobs and jobs in shipyards and all of the rest, these were not originally good jobs. And when people talk about wanting good jobs in their community, I think we should be clear that the best way to get good jobs in their community is to look at the jobs we actually have and think, how can we make those jobs better? How can we improve terms and conditions and worker satisfaction and wage levels and training in opportunities in the service sector, rather than how can we go about replicating a 1967, 1968 style heavy manufacturing economy.
Thank you. Alison, can I come back to you? Can I come back to you then? This is about, I think some of this is about emotional connection, but I also think some of this is about how things have changed, that actually the service industries have gone into cities, and a lot of the problems and people where we've lost have been outside big cities. So we can talk about having service level jobs that pay better, but actually those service jobs which pay better are not those which are in cities. They're not in the sort of big warehouses. I wrote about Bassett Law, and a lot of those jobs were in warehouses. They weren't in those warehouses were automating, and the good jobs were in cities. So that's where people went. So how do we keep that idea of place that isn't just a place about being in cities, and that idea of belonging and emotional connection and well-being?
Okay, so I'm really sorry to be boring, but whenever you hear somebody say, like, the thing is, the distinction is really A versus B, and when they're talking about the economy, then you can just ignore them, because it's not north versus south, it's not cities versus towns, you know, it's not rural versus urban, it's not east versus west, because for every one of those binary distinctions, I guarantee you the data shows counterexamples. So there are towns that do perfectly well, as parts of the north that are doing brilliantly. You know, there's even constituencies that are dominated by older people where our Labour votes just gone up. And if you don't believe me, it's called Sefton Central, it's the Merseyside. So for every one of those binary, it's this or it's that, just forget it, it's not true. What you actually have to do is take the economy as we think of it, which is basically like the macro picture, GDP, unemployment, take those big macro numbers and turn it upside down and look at the picture at the micro level and build up from there. Because for every, and you mentioned Bassett Law, Sally, for every place, its economy will be unique to the history, to the patterns of employment, and to the ways in which people move around and their travel to work area. You know, for every place, it's kind of unique. What we need, in my opinion, what we need is a series of tools that can be picked up and used by local and regional leaders to develop their economy, the sense of place and the sense of well-being that people have about where they live. And those tools won't be the same everywhere, and each of them won't be used, but it's important that we empower and enable people to work at that economic footprint level to build up. And just let me give you an example of what I mean by that. I grew up in Merseyside in the 1980s and 90s, and economically speaking, it was a bit of a disaster. Every year of my life, from when I was born to when I was 18, people left Merseyside, and that population collapse didn't stop until I was 18. And you know, the reason for that was to do with yes, deindustrialization, but also because, you know, there were more attractive jobs and careers elsewhere that people were moving to. Skip forward to now, because of the work that the Labour government did when it was in office from 97 onwards, and even more so that Steve Rotherham's doing as our Metro Mayor, we're seeing population growth again and the economy moving, and a fast growing economy. That is a collection of cities and towns that all have a unique offer, which is different to Manchester, it's different to Newcastle, it's different to Bristol. But we're seeing that because over a period of time, people use some of those economic tools to draw people in and to create a place that people could be proud of and have a sense of future there. So I suppose this is a long way from me saying, like, we just can't solve this problem with an economic conversation in Westminster. We have to be able to enable local and regional leaders to do that work for themselves, which I'm glad Keir mentioned evolution this morning. Actually, it is a terrible word, but really what we mean is people having a sense of power and control over the outcomes for their life. That is the economy, but it's also, you know, as I say, how whether they feel that they have success on their own terms. And I think that's possible for every place in the United Kingdom. We just have to create the toolbox.
Yes, but I do think there's lots of power and wealth in London, for instance, that isn't shared with the rest of the country. Duncan, is that right? Is that right? And should we be looking at how we share power, and not only power but also wealth from the centre to other parts of the region, and how might you do that to increase well-being?
It's interesting. So I mean, you know, what the government is now, you know, with levelling up, you know, the government is going to go back to talking about a lot, I imagine, for the next 2 years. What is really interesting about levelling up is, you know, it's aimed at small wins which will be felt quickly in parts of the country. You know, whether that's you know, doing up a bandstand or doing up a high street or putting new hanging baskets in through the Stronger Towns Fund. It's these small, very visible wins they're concentrating on first. And there's talk of it eventually being a wider program of economic transformation, but in the next year and a half, it's really going to be these sorts of things which people care about really deeply because they care about the state of their high street. And of course, many of these things are the result of 10 years of a big squeeze on local government budgets, which the government is now partially reversing. But if you think about how the government is going about it, things like the Stronger Towns Fund, I mean, it's almost the opposite of this devolution agenda. It's a big pot in Whitehall, in which towns bid for, and then if they're lucky, they get some money from the pot to do whatever local project they want to do. I mean, I think, going back to your wider point, Sally, on London, I don't think you need London to fail for the rest of the country to succeed. But it is worth saying, for 30 or so years, if you look back at how public investment has been assessed, the way they do it is the civil servants do up a thing called a benefit cost ratio. How much is this going to cost? What do we expect the benefits to be? And you can look up the benefit to cost ratio of all of these projects that have been proposed over the last 30 years. It is noticeable that projects in London tend to have tended to be approved with much lower scores than other projects, which might have had more impact, but were not in London. I'm always told by Treasury officials that's, the classic one would be extending the Docklands Light Railway, which would be a very expensive project. The benefit to cost ratio looked quite ropey. But meanwhile, things like trams in Leeds were with much higher benefit cost ratio were not approved. And I was told by one Treasury official, ministers are more likely to run into the CEO of a bank in Canary Wharf who will lobby them about the DLR extension in the Docklands than they are someone that will lobby them about the need for trams in the Northwest or Yorkshire. So I think there has been a problem with how some investment decisions have been made. And you can also say there's been a problem with how we score this, as we tend to sort of work on the basis that if an area is really high productivity and has really high wages, then investment there will have huge returns. But if you're thinking in that basis, you're always going to prioritize areas which are already very successful, rather than areas where lower levels of investment can lead to bigger structural changes. I think there have been problems with how we've gone about public investment, but I don't think public investment is the only thing that's been a problem on the regional balance of the British economy for the last 30, 40 years.
Ali, can I just add one thing there as well? Yeah. Your kind of London point, like, look, if pushed, nobody can do sort of anti-London rhetoric better than I. Like if required, I can do the kind of rough northerner act, right? But let's be real, the worst child poverty problems are in, there's problems everywhere, but like they're in Tower Hamlets in Rushnara's constituency. Like, let's not pretend that we don't need a plan for our country that also involves alleviating some of the massive challenges that London has. And, I want people in the area that I love and grew up in to be able to have a career there. I also want families in London not to permanently know that their kids will never own a home near them. And that's a flip side of the same problem. So let's solve it all together. Of course we can have a north versus south row, but I refer you all to the comments I made some moments ago. If people say it's this or it's A and B and it's a binary problem, then unfortunately they're wrong.
And of course, Alison, I'm from the northeast. I regard the Wirral as pretty much the Midlands, Alison.
So Alison, how do we make those connections? How do we make, because obviously this is about building connections, building an emotional idea of Britain and a connection of Britain that connects all those places up, that isn't about dividing them and say you're a certain sort of person if you come from here and you're a certain kind of person with certain needs if you come from here. How do you build those bridges between those various bits of the country so we have this idea of a whole country? I mean, that's what Peter's been talking about. It's also what Anas, I think, was really talking about. And how do we get that sort of emotional connection, not only locally to place, but also to the whole country? Hello?
So everybody's more than one thing. So, you know,
it's about identities, isn't it?
yeah, like, of course, on the political right, people will try and separate us in a binary way. You're leave or you'll remain, you're north or you're south. You know, frankly, a lot of the time, you're a man or you're a woman, or people will try to divide us on the basis of ethnicity or a whole range of things. The Labour movement has always been about not dividing people on that binary basis, that we see that people have loads of identities and they all cut across each other. So, you know, if I'm a working class woman, you know, working at a checkout in Tesco, I'll also understand, you know, not only my own cause of wanting better pay and a chance to progress, but I'll also understand other causes, like the fight of people from the LGBT community, because maybe, you know, someone I love is gay. So I'll also understand those fights and want to come together and be a part of it. And I think, so the first thing I think I would say is that we recognise that we've all got loads of different identities, and we need to involve people on all of those different identities to make sure that people have a sense that, you know, we can't be divided up in that way. And the second thing I would say is, this is my point about well-being, that I think we're at our strongest when we've got a clear sense of what the goal is. And I think having a population that is not just wealthy, but also healthy is the right thing. And I think that means taking a rounded view of what health means, mentally strong as well as physically strong. How do we get there? I think we should follow the evidence, but I think giving people a sense that we've got a national goal to make people healthier and happier as we do better in the economy. I think that's everyone's a part of that, aren't they? It doesn't matter which bit of the country that you're from. It doesn't matter, you know, what your background has been. I think that's something for everybody. And so I would say recognizing that we've got loads of different identities, but also having clear goals and everyone's a part of it is how we bring people together.
Thank you. And Duncan, economically, does that mean that we need to be a more equal society, and how does that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think anyone that really wants to speak for Britain as a whole needs to have a concern that, you know, it's not good enough just for the economy to be growing if 60 to 70% of that growth is happening in London and the greater southeast. That, you know, you need this growth to be better spread around the country. And you know, that's basically about turning Britain from being an outlier in Europe to being a more normal European country in terms of where growth is happening. But people need to be realistic that this is hard, that Britain is, you know, the government talks about levelling up now, and the government likes to talk about things as if it's the first one to think about them. But pretty much every government since the 1930s has had some plan for, you know, rebalancing the economy, rebalancing growth away from London and the southeast. The problem is, I called the book Muddling Through for a reason. British governments are quite bad at sticking to things for a long period of time. You know, you can chop and change. We've been through 12 or 15 different attempts at some form of industrial/regional policy in the last 50 years in Britain. The countries that have managed to make this work are countries where there's been a bit more cross-party buy-in, you know, investment cycles that last longer than 5 years, and an acknowledgement that, you know, if you're really concerned about sharing prosperity more widely around the country, you're not going to achieve that by moving a few more civil servants to the north and a few small, high-profile, quick-hit infrastructure wins. You know, I mean, when the government thinks about rebalancing, they often think about their capital budget. You know, can we spend more of the capital budget outside of London than we are at the moment? And that is all well and good, and there's a case for doing that. But, you know, the capital budget is about 1 in 12 pounds that the government spends. If you're serious about rebalancing, you need to be thinking about those other 11 pounds as well. So, you know, the single biggest financial transfers around the country are going to happen if they cut universal credit by £20 a week in September and get rid of the temporary uplift, which is meant to go in September. We know where the burden of that cuts will fall. They will fall disproportionately outside London and the southeast, and it's very hard to talk about about economic levelling up when your policy is taking money out of other parts of the country. I think if you want to think about this as a government, levelling up is not just something you do by building a railway line or funding some buses somewhere. You've got to think about it in all of your spending decisions and economic decisions you're making as a government.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. Alison, just we're having some comments in the chat. Someone saying that health. Alison's right. It is about health. This is about health. Someone else is saying that they feel that the discussion doesn't take account for one thing, whether a younger generation is more inclined to move away and move about compared with the last generation. Can you give us a few sort of closing remarks about how we would increase well-being and increase that health of the nation if in a Labour government? So what's that vision for as a Labour government?
Okay, well, the first thing that I would like to say on that is that Duncan is absolutely right about the kind of bitter irony of being lectured to by a Tory government on levelling up when in revenue terms, in annual spend terms, the local authority cuts they are literally the definition of the opposite of levelling up. I mean, it's a joke. So I don't think we should ever let them get away with it. On people moving about, I confess I don't know the statistics on increased prevalence. I will go away and look it up. But you know, I think this comes back to building places people want to live in, because like actually for me it is not about where people are from. Not to go all Merseyside, but like when that point, we got to that point when I was 18 where, you know, things were just starting to turn around, and it was always it's always the point that I remember of it is my dad giving me a long lecture at tea time once about how these students were going to save our city. John Moores University had just opened another big student halls, and the city centre was alive for the first time in 20 years, full of people. Students came, saved our city, and then after that tourists came, and we were capital of culture in 2008. And I think the Merseyside lesson, such as it is for the rest of the country, is if you're a place where people want to come and live, they do come and live there, and that gives you a sense of moving on. And that, you know, at the local level, that's Duncan's GDP point. If you've got more money being spent in the economy year after year, just opens up possibilities. If you've got less money being spent in the economy, it shuts them down. And this is why I focus on well-being. There's the sort of planning term for it would be amenity. Have we created housing where people have got a good local green space? Sport England tell me that we haven't, because we've got too many kids growing up in areas of housing where they haven't got enough open space to play in, and that's causing our health problems. But it's also giving people a lack of open air that contributes to that poor sort of health and happiness of the population. So I think my main point is build places people will want to live, and you'll get people coming to live there. It sounds obvious, but too often we think of people either being stuck where they are or having to escape. Well, it doesn't matter if people move around, as long as we've broadly got places with a good sense of amenity and where people want to live. Second point about kind of like young people in general, like, you know, I think that the past year has obviously been very, very challenging for young people, and I think we could all do well to focus on how to be ambitious for the next generation now, not just kids in school, but also older young people. And for me, that's something about whenever we do regeneration, if you're going to kind of rebuild a place, it should never just about be bricks and steel and new buildings. Often it is. It has to be about regeneration of minds as well. And I am also the Shadow Culture Minister as well as the Shadow Sport Minister, and that's where culture comes in. And we could have I could talk for about 3 hours.
We've got to stop now. We've got the next. We're running fast into that. This is obviously, it's a huge discussion, isn't it? It's about the kind of Britain that we want to see in the future as progressives. Thank you both very, very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you both, and to begin, I feel this is just the beginning of the discussion, to begin to start to thrash through these issues. So thank you so much. We are now moving on to our next session. This is the final session of the day. And I'm delighted to welcome all the way from New York, David Miliband, former Labour British Foreign Secretary and now Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee. David, I know, takes a keen interest in British politics and the Labour Party, but is also immersed in the US. So who better to kick off this discussion about reflections on Biden and the return of the progressive century? So over to you, David.
Sally, thank you so much. I really wish we were all in the same room, but it's wonderful to be able to have this kind of engagement. And well done with your Fabian pamphlet, which I enjoyed reading. And it said the host wants to unmute me, so I'm not sure if you heard any of that, but I was basically saying hello and nice to see you, and really looking forward to the session. And congrats on your Fabian pamphlet. Also, a really warm welcome to my two contributors from this side of the Atlantic. Matt Bennet, who is the Executive Vice President of Third Way. He's an alumnus of the Clinton administration and takes a really expert view of what's happening in American policy and politics. And Professor Sheri Berman from Barnard College of Columbia University, down the road from where I am. She's written a great book, but unfortunately it was from 20 years ago, about the renewal of social democracy. It came out in, I think, 1998. It has a very optimistic title, but since then, her most recent book is called Democracy and Dictatorship in Europe, which has a rather darker tinge as well as a more optimistic one. But I'm thrilled that both of them are here for this conversation. I'm reminded that after 1992, the last time Labour had lost 4 elections in a row, we talked a lot to those who were involved in the politics and policy of the Clinton-Gore campaign, but we also talked to people in Holland who were pioneering new labour market policies. We talked to people in Australia who were pioneering policies in respect of what they called creative nation. And it seems to me a fundamental part of the British renewal of Labour is to understand what is distinctive about our situation in the UK, but also what is structural and linked and consistent with what's happening in other parts of the world. And I hope that in our discussion today, we're going to get into that. We're going to talk, Sheri and Matt and I, for about 30 minutes. And then I really hope people will put questions into the chat and we can make this a genuinely transatlantic conversation. I thought I would just make one framing point just to set up the discussion, because we're going to range quite widely across policy and politics. And I just want to make a framing point, which is that in my experience, elections are won and countries are changed when 3 things come together. And it's really important that we understand how they are separate and how they are related. The first is coherence about our own beliefs. We can't win as the centre left if we can't decide whether values or policies, the pursuit of equal opportunity or the pursuit of nationalisation, are our lodestar. If we don't know what we stand for, values or policies, then how can the electorate? Second element is honesty and clarity about what the country needs going forward. When we win and govern well, it's because we're addressing the needs of the country in the future, not building a better yesterday. And then thirdly, and separately but relatedly, whether we have ideas to meet what the public want. There's no point in great ideas if people don't want them, but equally there's no point in parroting ideas from the public that we don't believe in or that don't match the needs of the country. And that seems to me to be the significance of what Tony wrote in the New Statesman this week about the need to be radical, but also credible and sensible. My read of the last 10 years is that we have not only been confused about each of those 3 questions, but we've been confused about how they relate to each other, and arguments have not been clear about what they were addressing, whether they were addressing an issue of our own beliefs, whether they were addressing an issue of what the country needs, or whether they were addressing an issue of the appropriate coalition to bring it into practice. And I hope that in the course of our discussion, We can be clear when we're talking about coalition politics. We can be clear when we're talking about what the country needs, whether it be the US or the UK. And we can be clear when we're talking about our own beliefs. Just to finish it and maybe put it in a rather stark term, there's a brilliant article by Robert Skidelsky about how Keynes had a conversation with the Labour Party in the interwar period. And Keynes became incredibly frustrated because Labour resisted Keynesianism in all sorts of ways, most famously in the 1929 government. And he said that Keynes ended up despairing that the Labour Party was trapped between the obsolete and the utopian. And it seems to me that in the course of certainly the next hour, but hopefully longer going forward, we will not be trapped between the obsolete and the utopian. So we're going to be practical and relevant, I hope. And my job as question master is to pose the questions to Matt and Sheri. So first question, Biden won, but the Democrats didn't do very well either in the House of Representatives or at state level. So starting with you, Matt, in your judgment, how good or bad were the November results?
Well, on one level, they saved the world, you could argue. So they were pretty good. I think that American democracy was at tremendous risk. If Trump had won a second term, we would live in an unidentifiable country after 4 more years of that. So obviously, I was elated by that and by winning very, very narrow majorities in both the House and the Senate, which has allowed Biden to do some of what he has set out to do. And I think he'll achieve more. He got obviously one big rescue package done. I think he'll get some more done. Most of it will be done with just Democrats having to wind their way through the very narrow rules exemptions. But on another level, they were very bad. First of all, obviously, Trump got 74 million votes after everyone took a look at his last 4 years and decided they wanted more of that. So that's pretty terrifying. And below the presidential level, the brand of the Democratic Party, the brand of the center left and the left in the United States is pretty evidently awful. We lost, on election day, we lost 14 House Democrats, one to a retirement, one to a person who had long serving but had served in the Trumpiest House district in America, and 12 were newly elected Democrats who had won in 2018, who had helped to make the majority in 2018, and just couldn't hold on under the kind of onslaught of lies and distortions that the Republicans were shoveling, but also because people were buying that. They were open to the proposition that a Democrat is a socialist or wanted to defund the police. So, I think it's a very mixed outcome.
Okay, good, thanks. Sheri, how would you answer that question? How good or bad were the results in November?
Follow up with what Matt said, which is, look, on the positive side, another 4 years of Trump would have been disastrous for the United States and the world. In addition, the Democrats won the presidency and just barely held on to the House and the Senate. The other positive thing is, if you look at the demographics, which is something I'm sure you folks have talked a lot about and will continue to talk a lot about, Biden did manage to claw back some votes in very important constituencies, particularly among, sort of low educated white working class voters, as well as, of course, among the upper educated. And that's important for a whole variety of reasons, not least of which is that those folks still make up the vast majority of the electorate. It is very hard to win elections letting those groups go. On the negative side, we have a president who was incompetent, who was corrupt, who was incredibly racially divisive, and yet, as Matt said, still managed not only to win 74 million votes, but to beat the polls. And frankly, the Republican Party overall did very well. So I think these elections were critical. And obviously, again, important that Biden won because, again, at the very least, it means that our democracy is somewhat safer and some progressive policies can be put in place. But I don't think that win should give the left in the United States any reason to sit back. There were some very dangerous long-term trends that I think are still playing out that we need to be very, very carefully examining.
Okay, so it's pretty sobering message, and we'll come to some of the micro elements. I mean, some interesting things to do with President Trump increasing his support among Latino populations and other aspects. But if you, given what both of you have said, what's your explanation for the results? Do you blame balkanization of culture because of the way people view the media? Do you blame campaign finance? Do you blame democratic policies? Let's do it in the same order. Matt, why don't you tell us, how do you explain this very mixed result in light of what to many parts of the world seemed like the most obscurantist and appalling presidency in American history?
Well, yesterday I read through a 340 slide deck, which I do not recommend to anyone, which was the result of a huge postmortem on 2020 that my organization, Third Way, has sponsored along with 3 others. And we just got the results yesterday. They did extensive interviews, data analysis, and looking at ads and other things. And unfortunately, the answer to your question is it's very complicated. The one thing we know for sure is it wasn't about money. Democrats were very, very well financed, thanks to the generosity of, for the most part, ordinary people. This wasn't driven by large donors for the most part, but almost no Democrat lost because they couldn't match their opponent financially. In fact, most of them outspent their opponents, some by orders of magnitude. What is clear is that Joe Biden was able to defend himself against the kind of spurious charges coming from Trump that he was a socialist, that he wanted to fund the police. And he literally said in a speech, "Me? Do I look like a socialist?" And he was able to do that successfully because he's been in public life for 48 years. He had $1 billion campaign behind him. He'd been vice president, so he had universal, not only name recognition, but a universal identity among American voters. People knew who Joe Biden was. But Xochitl Torres Small, a first-term member of Congress, a brilliant young Latina who had won a seat in southern New Mexico, was simply unable to withstand the torrent of lies about her being a socialist who wanted to kill the industry that fueled her district, which is the fracking for oil and gas. And she was unable to overcome a brand of Democratic politics that was driven in part by the presidential primaries, where Bernie Sanders almost won our nomination, and by the fact that we have very, very prominent voices in Democratic politics, very skilled, very prominent people, but they're pretty extreme. So Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a brilliant political leader, has 12.5 million Twitter followers, and Xochitl Torres Small had 24,000. So her identity was really forged by what people knew of AOC and by the distortions they were getting from the Republicans more than it was by what she was trying to communicate in her 2 years.
Great. I mean, we're getting some good questions in the chat, which I will bring in at various points. Just one thing which I was going to come to later, Matt. Do you think any candidate other than Biden could have won?
I do not. I mean, there may be people out there who could have, but I think in the field of candidates that were running in this cycle, look, it's impossible to know. Could Pete Buttigieg, with a hurricane force winds behind him, having won the nomination, have won? Perhaps. Amy Klobuchar, possibly. But it seems pretty clear that Biden was perfectly suited for this moment, particularly given where we were with the pandemic, what Trump was offering. And so I think Biden was the right guy, and I don't know if anybody else could have done it.
Great. Sheri, let's go back to the founding question to you, which is, how do you explain the results that you described in your first answer?
Well, look, I think what Matt said is true. It's complicated, but this is a Zoom room full of political types, so you all know that. So if you want to boil it down and make it a little bit more simplistic, obviously, than it really is, I do think the Democrats have a problem that's not entirely dissimilar to that facing their center-left compatriots in other parts of Europe, which is that they really have economic policies that are, for the most part, quite popular. And in fact, in the United States, more than in Europe, the economic policies that the Republicans, that is to say their main opponents, are peddling are horrifically unpopular if you look at the polling among citizens. Sometimes actually we've had polls that, when you ask people, look, do you support this policy, some Republican policy, without telling them that it's a Republican policy, they are so opposed to it that when told it is a Republican policy, even when they are Republicans, will say that they simply do not believe that that is in fact what the party is pushing, right? So on the front, the party has policies, has goals, as you put them, David, that are broadly supported. The question is what people are voting on, right? Just because people say they support something does not mean that that's what's at the forefront of their minds when they go to the ballot box. And the Republicans and their supporters in the media have been very effective at focusing voters' attention on non-economic issues, because those are the issues on which Republicans do best. So regardless of what Democrats do, they're going to call Democrats socialists. They're going to say they want to defund the police. They're going to say, well, they want to turn the United States into Venezuela. Now that's going to happen regardless of what the Democrats do. But insofar as they give the Republicans and their allies in the media more support for that, more evidence of that, it only makes it easier for Republicans to turn voters' attention to the issues on which the center left does less well. Now, the structural problem for the Democrats, as is the case in a lot of other center-left parties, is that many of their most important activists, the people who are most active in politics, who are most active on social media, are far to the left on these non-economic issues of not just the rest of the party and not just the rest of the party's voters, but the electorate at large. And so figuring out how to square that circle is a very difficult challenge. I will say, I also agree with Matt that when the election started, I was not a huge Biden supporter, not because I didn't like him, but because, he seemed like a person of the past. It's very important, I think, to match the politician to the time. I think Biden turned out to be the right person for this time in the United States. He was moderate. He was a well-known quantity. He was someone who could convince members of the electorate that the United States could return to some sense of normalcy in a time when normalcy was really much hoped for. Another time, I think Biden would indeed have faded into the woodwork, but you have to think about what people want at particular points in time. I think Biden turned out to be the right person for the right time. And I think that this gives the Democrats an opportunity to think for the next few years about what the next time is going to look like and how the party needs to be positioned both in a leadership and a policy profile perspective to suit those needs.
Sheri, I want to pick up a question that came up into the chat from Dr. Martin Yule, who said, what about COVID? Neither of you have mentioned COVID yet. I mean, generally suggesting that your voters inject bleach into their arms is not a sort of vote winner. To what extent do you think that this 2020 was a COVID election, or is the fact that neither of you have mentioned it to suggest it's not as important as we think?
Did you want to start with me?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, look, I mean, it was a COVID election in the sense that this was the primary challenge facing the country, right? What's puzzling to me, and I think Matt brought this up at the beginning too, is that, I would have thought that Trump's behavior would have just invalidated his candidacy, and yet it did not. And so, that does bring up some issues about, partisanship and polarization in the United States. But where it did matter, I think, and where it played to Biden's favor, as both I think Matt and I were sort of trying to indicate, is that people really wanted some sense of normalcy. It wasn't just that the pandemic had upended, individual and social lives, the lives, or rather societal dynamics, but also that people just wanted an end, I think, to some of the extra divisiveness that had been layered onto our political conversation as a result of COVID. And I think Biden's sort of reassuring manner and, expressed desire to help the country move past not just COVID divisiveness, but divisiveness more generally, I think it did help him. But we do have to think very carefully about politics in a country where someone like Trump, who, as you said, David, among his many other genius ideas, had suggested injecting bleach into your veins, that people were still willing to vote for him implies that Republican voters are willing to tolerate almost anything to keep Democrats out of office.
Let's get into this economy and culture, economy versus culture question, because it's obviously very live in many parts of the world. We know two things for certain: that over the last 30 or 40 years, the middle class has grown and the traditional working class has shrunk. And we also know that the proportion of the middle class that votes for center left has gone up and the proportion of the traditional working class that votes centre left has gone down. And I think it would be very useful for a British audience to hear about how that's being navigated. Matt, your organisation put out a very interesting report the week before last. I can't remember the name of the author, but it examined two electoral strategies at state level in North Carolina and in Ohio, where a governor candidate in North Carolina and a Senate candidate in Ohio had beaten the Biden trend. They more or less overperformed in traditional working class communities. And what you showed is that if Biden had managed to perform as well as Roy Cooper in North Carolina, governor, or as well as the senator, I've blanked on his name, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, he'd have had an absolute landslide. And it's the difference between sort of 42% or a 48% or a 52%. It would be great to hear you talk at a macro level about this culture and economy, culture versus economy question. But then also just to do a better job than I did of explaining what this argument is about North Carolina and Ohio, and then come to Sheri for a similar question.
So the question, as Sheri noted earlier, there is no doubt that when you break it down, Democratic economic proposals are more popular than Republican economic proposals. And one of the great mysteries that has confronted Democrats for my entire time in politics, which goes back to 1987, is why don't we do so much better than we normally do in elections given that dynamic? And the answer, I think, is both that we misread how to create a narrative around our economic proposals, and culture plays an enormous role as well. So on the misread side, we tend to forget that Americans are incredibly aspirational. And when we talk about raising taxes on the wealthy, and we say we're not going to raise taxes on anyone making over $400,000 a year, which is a very high threshold. Very few people in America make more than $400,000 a year. That doesn't sound good to a lot of Americans because they believe that they or their kids are going to someday make 400,000, or they think somehow that it's going to negatively affect them. So sometimes we kind of forget about how Americans feel about the economy in the way that we're talking about the proposals that, as in the abstract themselves, are very popular. And then one other point on that, which is and I think this is where the culture and economy come together. There is a feeling, and there's been some good sociology written about this during the Trump era, that Democrats are trying to help people jump the line. There's a metaphor that one author offered, which is that people are in line for the American dream, and that Barack Obama was taking people, particularly people of color, out of line and sticking them into line ahead of the white working class. So there was some resentment around economic policy itself, but obviously that shades heavily into culture. And this idea, replacement theory, is obviously an incredibly racist and charged idea, but there is an idea that the white working class, which until the mid-70s, you could do very well if you were a white guy with a high school degree, you could have a comfortable life in the middle class. That ended in the 70s, and there's a theory, not a theory, there's a feeling that is because other people, immigrants, people of color, were being advantaged somehow. So this is a very complicated stew of emotions, but culture and economics really can't be disaggregated. And then quickly on the point you raised about those two races, if you look at the way, for example, Sherrod Brown ran for Senate on the same ticket as a much more standard liberal candidate was running for governor that year, and he lost, and Brown won. The difference is pretty stark in the way that they talk about economics. Sherrod Brown incessantly talks about the dignity of work and how vital it is to reward work. And Richard Cordray, who was running for governor, he's a strong ally of Senator Elizabeth Warren. He's very smart. He'd done some very good things in the Obama administration, but he was talking about how we need to help lift up communities of color and, things that all Democrats believe in, but he didn't have that focus on the dignity of work. And in a white working class dominated state like Ohio, one works and the other doesn't.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Sheri, talk to us about how you see this interplay of culture and economics.
There's two ways to answer that question. I mean, the first is there's simply no doubt that in difficult economic times, it is much easier to whip up, as Matt said, this kind of sense that, somebody else is taking your place in line. Somebody else is to blame for your problems. And there's endless amounts of social science research showing, of course, that, more difficult economic times create more resentment against immigrants, more resentment against minorities, all that kind of thing. So on the one level, right, when you are going through the types of economic transformations that we have been going through in the last couple of decades, should anybody be surprised that it's quite easy for politicians and parties to come in and blame some other for those problems? That should not have been surprising to anyone. That should have been something that people were, aware of and playing against from the beginning. The other question, though, which is not entirely different, but is somewhat, sort of on a different plane, is if you look at, sort of the nature of political competition over the last couple of decades, right? And you look at, from an analytical perspective, the kinds of issues that politicians and parties have focused on, in electoral campaigns. There is a sort of very dramatic shift from the post-war decades up through the late 20th, in particular early 21st century. That is to say, much more emphasis being placed on non-economic issues over the last decades than was the case in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, when, again, campaigns would have been fought on, size of the welfare state, how many taxes should we be paying, those kinds of things. Now, once political competition pivots to non-economic issues, personally, I think that the left is at a structural disadvantage. And I think squaring this circle, again, figuring out how to address the real questions about racial equity, about assimilation, about dealing with increasingly diverse societies, these are not questions that the left can or should avoid. But again, to get back to your point, David, I think the messaging is important. And I think understanding what the goals actually are important, right? What type of society are we trying to create, given that we have more diverse societies and that minorities can no longer be kept in second-class status? We need to understand what kind of society we want, right? Do we want one that is cohesive and unified around certain goals, or do we want one where each group gets to, sort of set their own agenda and politics looks much more zero-sum? And then that in ways that can bring together voters, right? That can bring voters into a coalition where they see that their own particular goals do not compete with each other, but in fact build to something that is better for everyone. I do not think the Democratic Party has done a great job with that, although there's a lot of debate now about this kind of race, class, sort of how to address both of these things in ways that not only achieve your goals, but can attract the broad electorate that the left really needs in order to win elections.
That's very helpful. There's a word called valence, which Peter Kellner takes from chemistry, I think, and applies to politics. And valence essentially means the attractiveness. It's the sort of the soft power of your brand. And both of you are speaking to that, the importance of valence in one way or another. We're about halfway through, and rather than having one conversation amongst the three of us and then a separate conversation, of course, in the modern world, it's all mixed up together, but I'll try and do a good job of bringing in more of the questions from the side that fortunately they align with some of the ones that I've got. Let me just sort of, as a mid-hour break, offer a little reflection about how different our countries are, as well as how similar they are. You can't live in America or visit America for 2 weeks, never mind live here for 7 years as I have, without understanding how issues of race play differently in America than they do in the UK. I don't want to say at all that they're not important in the UK, but the history here is so fraught and so unresolved that I think it's important to recognize quite what a burden the country carries in its failure to address really the fact that the post-Civil War settlement has never been fully addressed in an open and transparent way, and many of the scars still live on. A very wonderful campaigner called Brian Stevenson wrote a book called Just Mercy, the central thesis of which was that there's never really been a truth and reconciliation for 150 years in America. Now, I'm not trying to put those words into your mouth, but I think that a couple of the questions in the chat relate to that, and I think that's really an important part of the story. I also think it's interesting, and I hope we'll get a chance to address this in the next half hour, how many write-ups of the 2016 election talked about a vote against the Democrats as being a misogynist vote or an anti-woman vote or an anti-feminist vote. And it will be interesting to hear you talk as well about whether there are gender differences as well as racial differences in the way in which American voters are moving towards one party or the other. Just as the intro to the next section, though, let me ask a question which I had in a rather less pithy way, but one of the earlier questions, I can't find it exactly, but it asked very well the following question: could Biden have won on the program that he is now governing on? Which I think is a good way of asking a question that I was going to raise with you, which is I was going to ask how important was the Biden program for the success of the campaign, which was, I suppose, a question more in the line of how important was policy in the campaign. But I actually think the question that was put in the chat by one of the audience members, which is, would the Biden program, I mean, just to give people a sense, he's got three $2 trillion bills in front of Congress, one of which has now gone through. And just to give you a sense of this, $2 trillion is 10% of national income. So cumulatively, that's 30% of national income. The UK national income is £2 trillion, so more or less $2.5 trillion. US national income, give or take, is $20 trillion. Maybe start with you, Sheri. And the question was a blunt one: could Biden have been elected on the program on which he's governed? And maybe to that, if he had, would he have been more or less successful?
So I'm actually curious to hear what Matt thinks about this. I mean, I actually think, David, that he's done economically all that much different from what he promised. I mean, he said, look, we need a big push here. Our country is in serious trouble, not just because of COVID, although primarily but because COVID has revealed some underlying structural problems with our economy that really need to be addressed. So I think he was very clear about, look, I'm coming in and I'm coming in big. I think he sold it obviously differently than Sanders or Warren would have, and I don't think that was of marginal import. But he was very clear about, what he wanted, and that he planned on doing something that was not business as usual. And frankly, that did not poll poorly, just the opposite actually with the electorate, which was, the country was very much suffering. So I think that's a problem. I would point out, though, that one of the things that I do think helped, and these are the sort of background conditions that I think are very difficult to quantify, which is that unlike in 2008, when Obama also came in a crisis situation, the whole structure of the conversation in the United States had just shifted dramatically. I mean, even mainstream economists, as you are well aware, David, and I'm sure everybody in this room is as well, had entirely shifted over the last 12 years. I mean, it's like spend, right? Even more conservative types understood that this was a time of crisis when a dramatic shift in economic, support for American citizens was called for. I think that made a huge difference. The number of negative voices out there about the overall need for a major push to address these problems was much, much smaller than it was in 2008 when Obama got much more pushback. Look, what since Biden's been in office? They've talked about Dr. Seuss and socialism, right? This is it, because they know that the polling on this is really pretty good and that Americans recognize the need for change. So I actually think he did all that much different, in the broad outlines.
Thanks, Matt. What's your take on the policy agenda and its relevance to this question?
I strongly agree with Sheri. And in fact, I think Biden did win on the program that he ran on. Now, he didn't incessantly talk about how I'm going to spend $6 trillion in the first 6 months of my administration, to be sure. But to Sheri's point, he did say we need a massive intervention to basically save people who are at risk of falling off a cliff. The bill that he had signed already had to be done by March 14th, because on March 14th, all sorts of benefits, including unemployment insurance, was going to run out. So there was a clock ticking on that, and that he was very clear about. But he also ran on the proposition that we were going to build back better. And that had very broad meaning. It meant that the economy that he inherited, that had kind of gone through massive transformation over the last 25 to 30 years from technology and globalization, simply was out of whack. It did not work for too many people. And opportunity has become incredibly concentrated in the hands of very few people in very few places. And that has to change. And we have to grapple with an existential global crisis of climate change that is also going to be very expensive and could provide real opportunity for the United States economically to build things here that can help address climate change globally. So I think he's doing pretty much what he promised. But this raises another point, which is probably too long to go into, which is how do we think about center-left politics now? The problem, I think, here, and I can't speak to British politics, but I bet there's a little of this there too, is that when someone says, I'm a moderate Democrat, they immediately think of Bill Clinton. But Bill Clinton was governing a completely different world. You know, the world looked it was a unipolar world where America was creating 20 million new jobs and booming, and China was still a pre-industrial country. So when you think about what it means to be a moderate Democrat, you cannot think about the program that Bill Clinton instituted in 1993. You have to look at what Joe Biden is doing now.
Great. Let's stick with you, Matt, because quite a few people, by the way, Build Back Better, of course, Boris Johnson has jumped on this bandwagon and is running on Build Back Better. So we're going to come in a moment to what the right is up to and whether or not the fate of the Republican Party is has got global, is a global trend. But I just want to come to you, Matt, and then to Sheri on a question about how important organizing is relative to ideas in the modern world. A lot of people have asked about Stacey Abrams and the Georgia result, and maybe you could, Matt, could explain how remarkable that was or wasn't, depending on your point of view. And you or Sheri, it would be great if you could also get into some of the social media questions, the balkanization of public debate questions. One of the points in the chat was that a suggestion that Spanish social media, untranslated Spanish social media, explains some of the rise in Trump's support among Latino populations. But we wouldn't be doing justice, I think, if we didn't speak to the way politics is done, not just to the content of politics. And so if you could speak to that, and then I'll ask the same question to Sheri, that would be great.
So one of the big findings of our postmortem, where we did look carefully at Georgia, is that Stacey Abrams pulled off a miracle. I mean, it was a stunning result in Georgia. Georgia had been a reliably red state. It was impossible for Democrats to win statewide there in most cases for the better part of 2 decades. And what she was able to do, particularly in the runoff, was turn out a surge of new voters in truly remarkable ways. And most of them were, many of them at least, were voters of color that are very difficult to turn out. Georgia has a runoff system that was put in place in the 1960s explicitly to prevent Black voters from having too much power, because the theory was that they simply weren't going to turn out in a secondary election that took place in January. So what Stacey was able to do was amazing. And it was on top of Democrats having told their candidates and their campaigns not to do door-to-door campaigning during the pandemic for all the obvious public health reasons. That turned out probably to have been a pretty serious mistake, both from a public health perspective, because door-to-door stuff is mostly done outdoors, but also from a political perspective, the Republicans did not suspend that kind of canvassing and probably benefited from it. But during the runoff from between November and January, there was a massive amount of grassroots organizing done, some in person, and that was likely very impactful. And then on to your second point about social media, it cannot be overstated how important what is moving on social media is to American politics, both misinformation, which is just, we have a pandemic of misinformation, some of it coming from Russia, much of it not. A lot of it is homegrown, and battling that has been very tough. And if you look at the way that Republicans were able to harness, Facebook groups and that kind of thing, there's no question it had a huge impact. And then finally, the Latino vote is what we have been discovering more and more is incredibly heterodox. I mean, it is just unbelievably complicated. You cannot have the same messaging going to Venezuelan Americans that you are sending to El Salvadoran Americans as to Mexican Americans. And unfortunately, Democrats just didn't get that nuance, and that was a big problem.
Matt, just while you've got the floor, just say something. There was a question in the chat from Ellie Anderson about a youth vote. What does your detailed work reveal about youth turnout, motivation, etc.?
Same as it ever was. Every year we're told that the young people are going to save us, and they never, ever do. It is just incredibly hard to get young people to turn out. We did a little better getting youth turnout up in 2018 when we were trying to put a check on Trump, who young voters for the most part truly loathed. But it fell back a little bit in this cycle as compared to normal presidential years. It was more on par, and it's just the constant white whale for Democrats. If we can only turn out youth voters, then everything will be better. I will say one quick thing also. Republicans have been very aggressive at voter suppression, including suppressing youth vote. For example, not allowing polling places on college campuses, not allowing registration to be carried over. There's all kinds of tricks that they use to get young people not to vote, and it's been pretty effective.
Great. Sheri, let's turn to you on this organizing question. And if you can give it any comparative perspective, because you're an expert on social democratic politics globally, not just in the US, that would be brilliant.
Back to your original sort of tripartite schema for what the left needs. I mean, you could clearly add on a fourth, which is organizing, right? Which is that, in an earlier era, the way in which parties, and in particular center-left parties, organized was, pretty straightforward. There'd be a reliance, first and foremost, on unions and a whole variety of other kind of traditional mechanisms. I mean, that, along with everything else, has really shifted in the last several decades. I mean, the way in which you organize and mobilize voters really has been transformed. So I would say, look, alongside needing fresh, viable, attractive ideas, you need to have fresh, viable ways of organizing and mobilizing voters. And this means both at the grassroots level and via media, which of course has entirely changed as well. And in the United States, I mean, the Democratic Party really dropped that ball a lot over the last several electoral cycles. As Matt and you said, David, at the beginning, at some states, the Democratic Party had essentially disappeared, just given up the ghost. And, the opportunity, therefore, for really committed entrepreneurs like Stacey Abrams to make a difference is there, because there was just, the grassroots organizing was just really way below where it needed to be. I will say though, Matt, I mean, you are probably more expert at this than I am, although I am an avid consumer of the literature. I mean, my understanding that in Georgia, key to that win was not just organizing minority voters, but there was a significant shift over the last, several years in how white folks have voted there as well. And given their numbers, that's just as important, right? I mean, you want to get all of your potential voters aware and, to the ballot box. But just to get back against the initial question, David, look, if you want to win elections, you need ideas, you need policies, you need messaging, yes, but you need to be able to organize voters. And that means both at the grassroots level and via social media, and thinking about, you have great ideas and great policies and nobody knows about them and you're not setting the agenda, then, you're chit-chatting with yourself on Zoom. So for the left to think about winning, it needs to think both about, sort of again, what the politics are, but also about how to get the voters to hear them, right? And to vote on the basis of them. And that means grassroots organizing, that means media.
Okay, look, we've got 15 minutes to go, and we need to talk a bit about the right, which is no longer conservative. I mean, it's radical and in some ways revolutionary, and in some ways, I talk about a sort of Trotskyist right wing, where you bid up and up and up the level of purity that's demanded. The Republican Party has been transformed into a Trump appreciation society. This week, the number 3 person in the Republican Party got turfed out for being insufficiently loyal to President Trump. Should we start with you, Sheri? Talk a bit about what it means to be facing a different kind of right, a right that is not just shape-shifting in the traditional Tory sense of adapting to the modern world, becoming high spending when they need to be, but actually becoming fundamentally anti-democratic in a fundamental way, and challenging to the political system in quite dark ways. I think it would be very interesting to hear you talk about the challenge for social democrats to defend liberal democracy as well as to defend social democracy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think in this case, the United States is somewhat different. I mean, the Republican Party now, by all measures, you know, for political scientists like myself who spend time studying these kind of things, is much, it's akin to, you know, the National Rally in France, or even Orban, or Fidesz, or, you know, the Peace and Justice Party in Poland, right? Which is, if you look at its profile, it is not a center-right party anymore. It is not even the British Conservatives. It is really far off in space. And so this puts the left in the United States in a dilemma that I think some parts of the Democratic Party haven't fully confronted, right? Which is, we're not just fighting for progressive policies. We're not just fighting for a fair economy and more justice for underprivileged and disadvantaged groups. We are simply fighting for the perseverance of our liberal democracy, because the party that we are opposed by is no longer committed to upholding the rules of the game. And I think in that kind of situation, your priorities do have to shift a little bit. I mean, the Democratic Party, if it wants to keep playing the game, if it wants to keep the United States a liberal democracy, really has to prioritize protecting those kinds of things. And that means, first and foremost, winning elections. Look, every party wants to win elections, right? But we can't have purity tests in the Democratic Party when losing elections means giving power to another party that is really not committed to liberal democracy at all. I think this really puts the Democrats in a very, very difficult position. The Conservatives in Britain, look, you know, Boris Johnson, whatever you want to think about him, you know, and his, you know, sort of semi-problematic moves earlier on, he is just not Donald Trump. And his willingness to move to the center on economics to capture some of those votes is very smart on his part. He has a good sense of where the electorate stands. Trump is voters by telling them things about their fellow citizens and about the country that they live in that are not just lies, but are simply undermining democracy as we know it. And this is a very, very difficult challenge for the Democrats to deal with. And I think recognizing that the Republicans are not the Conservative Party, they're not the Christian Democrats in Germany, they have now moved into the far right populist camp as far as their commitment to liberal democracy is concerned, is really, again, something that is quite distinctive among advanced industrial nations.
And just to pursue the point a little, it's quite remarkable in a two-party system, because one of the things about the European, continental European systems that you study is that there are far-right parties, but in the main, they are separate from the mainstream conservative or Christian democratic parties. But nonetheless, in a two-party system, if you're right that they're becoming an anti-democratic party, they're still getting half the vote. So that's a pretty serious state of affairs.
Yes, it is indeed.
Okay, Matt, what's your take on this, on what's happening on the right?
I agree with every word that Sheri said, and I would just extend the thought a little bit, which is January 6th of 2025 will be a day that it'll be a hinge moment in history. Either our democracy will live or die on that day, because that's the day that the next presidential election will be taken to Congress, and the House of Representatives will decide whether they're going to, if the Democrat wins the Electoral College, whether they're going to affirm that win as they must under law and custom or not. And if they don't, I believe American democracy will be over. We will be hungry. To Sheri's point, the winner of that election will be Viktor Orban. So I have not been as alarmed about the state of our politics, even during the Trump years, as I am now. I think we face the greatest threat to our democracy since the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's because, as Sheri noted, the Republican Party has gone from being the party of Reagan, which had sharp and serious policy differences with Democrats, to the party of the Tea Party, which was a kind of radical conservative party that was controlled by their most conservative elements. But the debates were over policy, over how much government should spend, how much government should be in your life, to a party that is profoundly illiberal and anti-democratic. And that is a completely new thing for the modern era.
I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about the next question while I talk about it. But I want to you to both think, which politician or politicians do you think have done best at understanding the Trump phenomenon and taking it on? And the reason I want to ask you that question is that a lot of the chat is saying you're underestimating the danger of Johnson. Some people saying, look, he may be cleverer than Trump, but he's as unscrupulous when it comes to suppressing votes or lying. There are other people saying, yes, he may have moved on economic issues, but on social issues, he's as divisive. I mean, the general theme is never underestimate how far his opportunism will take him, because it could take him off the rails in very dangerous directions, and he certainly has a hold over his party. So I think it would help a British audience to hear you point us to the websites or the names of politicians who you think have really not succumbed to Trump derangement syndrome, but have actually understood the appeal of it and found ways to take it on in the most effective way. Obviously, you might say Biden, but you're other than him, where would you point people to avoid just getting into a total funk and actually send some political arrows of a powerful kind? Matt, should we start with you?
That is a really good question, and obviously Biden is the cop-out answer. I do think, though, that there are lessons to be learned for your audience in how Biden managed Trump during the campaign, where he basically ignored Trump's fulminating and talked. He did what Tony Blair says you should do in that New Statesman piece. He talked about how his administration would make people's lives better in very fundamental ways, and he avoided the traps that too many Democrats have been falling into around cultural issues. But I think there's a few others. I would point to Amy Klobuchar, who had been a candidate for president. She's a senator from Minnesota. She is both by kind of personality and her politics, she's a moderate, but she is tough. And she got into it with Ted Cruz in a recent Senate hearing. She manages to push back firmly, but without, again, stepping on some of the landmines that they've tried to strew about relating to culture. And then the one other I would say is Pete Buttigieg, who is now the Secretary of Transportation. He is a remarkable political talent. He's a young guy, but he's just extraordinary. And he goes on Fox News, and you can easily find this, and just eviscerates his opponents on Fox News. And that's a pretty good model also.
Yeah, I think if people look at it, was sort of September, October, where Buttigieg became the kind of representative from Planet Biden to Fox News. And right. He sort of infuriated them with his eloquence. Sheri.
Agree with Matt on some of his choices. I would say another really good choice that he mentioned earlier would be someone like Sheri Brown, who is able to talk to the fears and concerns of voters without playing to divisiveness, and understands that the best way to deal with right-wing populists is by addressing the concerns that some voters have that lead them to vote for folks like that. I mean, look, I think it's very important for people in general, supporters of democracy with a small d, as well as leftists, to sort of divide those voters into two groups, right? One group, which I personally think is somewhat smaller than many on the left do, is people who are just, they're lost, right? These are truly bigoted voters who are illiberal and anti-democratic, who you just are never going to reach, right? But I do think there is a significant number of voters for whom fear and concern and ignorance are really, at play, and getting a way to reach those people should be a really important goal of the left. I think folks like Sherrod Brown and Biden understand that. The best way also we have from a comparative perspective, because that's what I have, if you look at other countries that have faced these kinds of dilemmas, Turkey, Hungary, places like this, the best way to deal with these kinds of firebrands like Trump, right, is not necessarily by fighting back against them using their own methods, right, but talking directly to the concerns of voters, right, and trying to convince them, right, that the better way is possible. If you look at the way elections were won, for instance, in mayoral races in Turkey or in Hungary, you don't spend all of your time attacking how corrupt and divisive and terrible whatever your opponent is, Orban, Trump, Erdogan. You talk to voters, you explain to them the positive ways in which their lives can change and the practical ways in which you can address their concerns. And you almost, again, push these dangers to the side, not because they're not there, but because you understand that the best way of dealing with them is addressing the reasons voters choose these kinds of people in the first place. And I think folks like Sherrod Brown and some of the others that Matt mentioned address this. I will say one thing. I had so many debates with my British friends months ago about which country was in the worst situation, the UK or the United States with Trump. And one thing that is worth pointing out, putting aside whether Johnson is more unscrupulous or amoral than Trump is that what made Trump really dangerous was not just that he's a cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs and immoral and unscrupulous and corrupt. It's that his party was entirely behind him. And as Matt said, they have continued to be that way even after a violent attack on our Capitol. The question that should concern folks in Britain is not just how bad Johnson is, but whether if he tries to undermine fundamental principles of your democracy, if the party would stick behind him, that's the real danger. That's the real danger. I'm not convinced that's true, but that's the kind of signs that people who are worried about the future of their liberal democracy should be focused on.
Great. Look, last question, and we've got 2 minutes, and we have a radio show in the UK called Just a Minute, where you're invited to speak without hesitation, repetition, or deviation for 1 minute. So I'm going to do that to both of you by asking the following question. The launch of this Progressive Britain network that you're speaking to today says in its news release today that the centre left has spent too much time attacking the hard left and not enough time coming up with positive ideas of our own. And so the last question to each of you is, tell us a bit about the ideas that are exciting you at the moment, either in your own work or that of others. So let's start with you, Matt, and then go to Sheri, and then we'll hand back to Nathan Ewell, who will close the conference.
Well, I think the most exciting thing that we are working on, along with many others, is something I touched on earlier, which is the enormous economic opportunity that clean energy offers the United States. Actually Britain as well. Britain has a pretty robust, for example, nuclear energy industry and other things. But for the United States, we can actually build things here that will power the world. There is just zero question that the world is going to move to clean energy, whether Republicans in the United States like it or not. That is going to happen because climate change is an undeniable fact. And for too long, the green groups in the US made responding to climate change all about pain. All it was going to be is you have to give up things that you like, you have to pay more, you have to eat your peas. And what Joe Biden was able to do is turn that on its head and say, no, this is a huge opportunity. We can actually do things here that we can do well by doing good, pardon me. And I think that's one of the most exciting things we face right now.
Great, thank you. And I think the only repetition was the word energy, and I think you're allowed that one. Sheri, last word to you.
The left has to reconvince voters of the same thing that it convinced voters of in an earlier era, which is that, you know, economic change, capitalism, whatever, is here to stay. But we have ways of managing that so that everybody has an opportunity to do well, that children have an opportunity to improve on the position where, you know, their parents were. And that just because somebody else is doing well doesn't mean you can't do well at all. Diversity is an opportunity for us to grow in new ways, not an opportunity for us to divide against each other. I'm going to add one last thing because I'm an academic, which is the following. De-alignment of voters has been something that's been going on in Europe and the United States for decades. Losing an election should be an opportunity for reflection, but I think if the left doesn't understand that the challenges that it faces have been accumulating for decades, and that therefore the way to address them will require long-term planning about ideas, messaging, and organization, it's never going to be able to regain the footing that it wants to have to be a viable competitor for governing power. So think for the long term, but remember to address the challenges that people are facing today.
Look, I think that's a really helpful note to end on. It made me think, Sheri, about my last word, which will be to point people to a really important book by a woman called Jane Mayer. It was a book called Right Turn, and it explained the shift in American politics and especially in American law over the last 30 or 40 years. And let me just summarize it in 30 seconds before handing over to Nathan. Jane Mayer's argument is that you win in politics by operating at three levels. First of all, the level, she called it philosophy, but it's really the level of ideas. That's the level of university departments. She said, secondly, you have to mobilize around issues, which is the role of think tanks. And thirdly, you have to mobilize in civil society, mass mobilization. And she gives the example of the anti-abortion movement, a range of other parts of the American right, the tax-cutting movement, that have operated at the level of ideas, at the level of issues, and at the level of mass mobilization. And I think as we think forward about the centre-left, whether in Britain or anywhere else, if we neglect each of those three levels, each of those levels, we will fall into the traps either of obsoletism or of utopianism, neither of which get us anywhere and which have plagued us for too long. So on that note, I really want to thank you, Sheri and Matt, for giving some time to your cousins across the Atlantic, to our cousins across the Atlantic, who really are looking for a renewal, and really appreciate the way you've contributed in such an honest and open way. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to Nathan.
Okay, thanks, David. Excuse me. And a little anecdote, actually, just to sort of segue the sessions, as we're talking about now Secretary Buttigieg, a friend of yours, David, Anne Sassoon, who's on the call today, actually has photos of her dandling then very young baby Buttigieg on her knee when she was an academic with his parents at some Gramscian seminar back in the late 1970s. So just be careful, the rest of you, the strange connections that can accrue from these types of events. David, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. Quickly, guys, if you will, just give me 5 minutes to talk you through some figures and to give some thanks. 852 people signed up for this conference today, which Matthew Faulding and other people who've been here longer than I have basically told me this is by far the biggest turn up or take up we've ever had at a Progress conference. We had over 600 people watching Kia at one point this morning. And the fact that at its peak, we had 360 people still here, 7 hours later, after quite an intensive day, I think is fantastic. So thank you very much to all of you for coming. Thanks, of course, to all our speakers and the hosts and the participants. It's a shame, actually, that I was running this conference, because I actually wanted to sit and take notice of what everyone was saying instead of frenetically WhatsApping through most of it. But I'm looking forward to sitting down and watching all these sessions when we upload them onto the new website over the course of the week. I think specifically, though, I've got to mention those people without whom this Zoom would have fallen off the airwaves many hours ago. So specifically, I would like to thank Rebecca, Liam, Ellie, Jimmy, Jamie, Nathan, the other one, Josh, Barry, Perline, Lloyd, Matthew, Sally, Kira, Joseph, and Frankie. Quite frankly, you've been a fantastic team to work with, and I think if it wasn't for you, this day would not have been the success it's been. Next, I want to talk about some next steps. We're going to take our time over the summer, basically, to engage and to evolve and decide exactly what progressive Britain is going to look like. The statements that was sent to every attendee this morning, and we will be publishing more widely on the website this evening, is basically the starting line for this. We want to get it right. So basically, we will be coming back before party conference with more people, with our priorities, and crucially with the kind of policy areas that we want to specialize in. We're still a small organization. We're still a small team. We are not, never suggest we could create policies and do thinking across the whole gamut of policy that Labour needs to get on the front foot about. But basically, by discussing with you guys out there, we hope we can refine that over the summer. I think we already have an events programme in the works. We're definitely doing some collaborative series of events with various academic, think tank and other political organisations and institutions. To begin with, we're prioritising on issues of political economy and coming back into some of those questions we've heard quite a lot about today, about how we have a better and proper reflection of our past, and how potentially having a better understanding of that past could help us provide us rather with a foundation for the future. We're also kickstarting the podcast again and various other communication methods. And I think for all of you that are members, stick with us. We're going to be much more on the front foot with a forward-facing offer for our members. And if you're not, this is a perfect opportunity and time to join up. I think quickly then, the key takeaways from me today are about context, and they're about the continuum of individuals and ideas and debates and where we are. I think David's session and also some of the history sessions really brought home to me that we're not in this alone, that actually there is a proud history behind us that we can learn from as long as we are not shackled to it. And also there are comrades in America and across the globe that we should work with together to tackle some of these issues. I think it's really fantastic having Matt here from Third Way. We were talking earlier on this week about how potentially we could collaborate together. I think the reception we've had today really underlines for me that we've done the right thing, that actually it's time to come together. And very much like we did with Labour to Win last year, let's start not afresh, but let's reconsolidate our position around progressive Britain and really get on that front foot. I think it's time really for us to start redefining who we are and why we are here, and make the case for why progressive Social Democrats and the Labour Party are really at the forefront of the recovery that we need to engage in. And quite frankly, without us foursquare behind Keir and his project, we're not going to win the next election. I think last week really was a wake-up call. So basically, we've now got to really be honest with ourselves that we've got to get stuck into a work of reconstruction in the Labour Party, both in, as Sheri just said, in terms of ideas and in terms of messaging and in terms of organising. I think it's really great that Keir came here today to actually tell us that message himself. So I think it's time for everyone here to get their thinking caps on, because we will come calling. I want to crowdfund and crowdsource the ideas in the future. It's not us being in an ivory tower telling you what to do. So essentially, on that note, we've got a big challenge ahead of us. I'm confident with the reception and the breadth of support we've had today that we can do this if we work at it together. So all I've got to say then is thank you very much. I hope you enjoy what's left of your Sunday. I've got my dinner waiting, and God knows I'm ready for it. So anyway, cheers everyone. Thank you so very much, and hopefully, definitely this time next year we'll be meeting again. So in public. So anyway, thank you very much. Take care.